My name is George Phillips. I am the curator of paleontology at the Museum of Natural Science in Jackson, Mississippi. Curator is a glorified term for caretaker. I am caretaker of the state fossil collection. That must be a cool job, huh? So I do mostly research at the museum, but I do some outreach. I think that a lot of the people that I interact with in the public, particularly at the museum, and especially young mothers with boys between 4 and the ages of 8, must think I stay in the back all day playing with dinosaurs, little toys. But I don't. I seldom study dinosaurs. I've published on dinosaurs, and we're going to talk about one dinosaur in particular today. But I work on other things primarily. A lot of little things, a lot of lowly creatures on the seafloor. Some of these things you've never heard of outside of a restaurant menu, right? My dad was always joking about that when he was alive. I talk about some of these fossil creatures. Now, he did not have a background in biology, but I learned my love of the outdoors from my father and my love of history from my mother. But my dad would often joke that some of these species I would talk about on the seafloor, he'd wonder what they tasted like. And that's a typical Southern thing, wouldn't you think? Especially if you're in a family full of cooks, and we all like to cook. Uh-oh, we've got an alert here.
Just say okay.
Okay, hit okay.
There you go.
Since about 2013 or 14, since about the time they first started four-laning Highway 15, myself and others, mostly out-of-state, but some in-state, including a lot of avocational paleontologists and geologists, some of whom are here today, some of whom are in school to become geologists and paleontologists, and others who have an intense interest in helping the research world, like my friend Kendall Bullock in the back, who told me not to point him out, but I'm going to anyway. He's actually discovered some of these sites, and I told him several years ago that we need to be watching Highway 15 in the future. Because Highway 15, as you're going to see during the course of this slideshow, contains some interesting geology around it that we seldom get to study, but have more access to now because of the highway construction. But first I want to tell you about a feature that's located under and sometimes on either side of the highway. And along this feature that we'll mention in a map called the Pontotoc Ridge. So keep those in mind. So the KPG boundary, which we're going to define here, and the Pontotoc Ridge are roughly synonymous with one another. The KPG boundary is a geologic feature that, in part, causes the topography along the Pontotoc Ridge. But the boundary itself is a major stratigraphic break. It's a major geologic break and a geological signature and fossil record change documenting a major event in Earth's history 66 million years ago. So think of the Highway 15 marking a point in time about 66 million years old. And it varies because the boundary is not straight, but Highway 15 roughly follows the course of it as the boundary winds in and out and wraps itself around Highway 15. This boundary has been studied globally for many decades. And in Mississippi, we first started focusing on it about 2010 when we had interest from the American Museum of Natural History in creating a working group, and that's a group of researchers, some academic, some in museums like myself, and an avocational interest, all pooled together to study something that is of great global interest and really hasn't been studied outside of Kemper County prior to 2010. At least hasn't been published on outside of a small site in Kemper County since 2010. But it is a very important feature. It's important to a lot of people. And as luck has it, it falls along Highway 15. To give you an example of what the boundary looks like at other locations, I'm only going to show you the spectacular photos of what the clear boundary looks like at a few sites in North America and in one site in Africa. But at many locations, it's easy to find because it can be visualized as this thing that I mentioned in that first phrase. It's a major stratigraphic break. And by that, we mean in simplest terms, it's a major color change that's typically a major rock change or sediment change across this plane. And you're seeing these layers, these horizontal layers, typically horizontal, doesn't always have to be. The places we've studied has been horizontally lying. So you think of a cake. And so think of a major break in cake, like those rainbow cakes where each layer is a different color. And we're focusing on the green. Isn't the green usually in the middle? I can't remember, it's been a long time since I had one of those cakes. But here it is at Trinidad Lake State Park. This one's open to the public for people to see. This one's in Alberta, Canada, Badlands. You can easily see a stratigraphic break there. This one's a little bit difficult to see simply because, and these beds are inclined, as you can tell they're at an angle. And actually the boundary goes into the hillside. But not much of a color change there, so in those cases you're looking at other types of changes. And that's what we're trying to find and interpret along Highway 15. Now, the fellows that are helping with me, all my volunteers and students that have helped with this, we've seldom seen a clear boundary like this. Wouldn't you agree? But I'll show you on a clearer boundary in Houston, Mississippi, where we'll begin our KPG journey here in just a few slides. Oh, there's the slide. As luck would have it, it's the next slide. The boundary is very clear here between the Cretaceous, which is symbolized with the K. The universal symbol for Cretaceous is K. And the formation is called the Prairie Bluff Formation around Houston. And the beds above it, the first several meters, several yards of sediment above it are not really straightforward. They're not homogeneous. There are multiple layers. Hard to see all the layers here, but there are multiple layers documenting a story that happens between the Cretaceous, the end of the Cretaceous, and the beginning of the Paleogene proper. And that's what the PG represents. The PG stands for Paleogene, and I'll remind you of this again as the slideshow progresses. But the Paleogene, and it goes by different names locally. The name of the Paleogene sediment locally that's at the bottom of the Paleogene is called the Clayton Formation. Are the words showing up okay on the slide? Okay. This is a picture early on in our collaborations, and this is the American Museum of Natural History team, part of them, and a student on the left from the City University of New York, Brooklyn College. This is a geologic map of Mississippi showing a layer cake type of, a typical layer cake type of geologic structure. The oldest layers are in northeast Mississippi, such that if you run a line perpendicular, in this case a curve, perpendicular, the more further west and southwest and south you go, the sediments get younger and younger. And of course vice versa, when you go to North Mississippi or East Mississippi, you get into progressively older sediments. So just think of this as East Mississippi and this is West Mississippi. Those beds are tilted somewhat at about the rate of 30 feet per mile on average. So we're looking at a layer cake that's sitting on its side. Is everybody kind of clear on what's going on there? Now, these geologic layers produce a topography. That is, they produce a terrain that where we have names for different parts of the major subterranes throughout Mississippi. So most of Mississippi lies in this feature called the coastal plain. But the coastal plain is subdivided into these smaller subunits, these smaller terrains like the Tombigbee Hills, also known as the Tennessee Tombigbee Hills in northeastern corner of the state. The Black Prairie or Black Belt, where I grew up. I grew up in the little town of Artesia in the southern part of the Mississippi Black Prairie. And we are now all located in what physiographic or what topographic region? right now. New Albany is in,
Pontotoc Ridge.
I'm sorry?
Pontotoc Ridge.
We are in the Pontotoc Ridge, but we're just on the edge of the Flatwoods. So for those of you I thought might have said Flatwoods, that's kind of true too. I think the western outskirts of town are actually in the Flatwoods, technically speaking. But so these are the topographic, physiographic, geomorphic, different terms. These are just the terms given to these, the hilliness versus floodplains, et cetera, that kind of categorization, independent of the geologic names, but the geology influencing these topographic features. Now, focusing on northeastern Mississippi, we're going to look at 5 towns. We're going to only focus on 4 of those, and the northernmost 3 in particular. But the Pontotoc Ridge actually begins north of Ripley, Mississippi, and ends in Starkville, Mississippi. And it passes west of West Point and produces a set of hills called what, you West Point natives?
Kilgore.
The Kilgore Hills. Yes, sir. Thank you.
I'm from West Point.
That's right. So each one of these towns may have their own names for the local hills, but it's a very distinct set of hills in the Pontotoc Ridge there in western Clay County called the Kilgore Hills. But those hills play out just south of Mississippi State University in South Farm, for any of those familiar with Mississippi State University. It disappears at South Farm, which is an outdoor agricultural facility as part of the Mississippi State University system. But they pass through Houston, Mississippi, and the hills are not always, the ridge is not always well developed. Some places it just completely disappears, but it's all part of this same geologic feature that is defined on its western flank by the KPG boundary, what we're talking about today, and on its eastern flank by a limestone that's in some places called the Chihuahua limestone around Pontotoc. And around New Albany, it's often called, at least among geologists, I know you guys probably don't call it, but the little community of Cownville. Everybody know Cownville? Okay, so it's often called the Cownville limestone when it passes through there. And here is a map showing, it's not a very good map, or at least Highway 15 doesn't stand out really well, but you can sort of see Highway 15 following the western portion, following along the western flank of the Pontotoc Ridge, all the way down to Houston, Mississippi. Now, with respect to these geologic time divisions that we've been mentioning already, the Cretaceous period and the Paleogene period, this is what they look like in a basic, simplified stratigraphic column. So we're looking at that time interval 66 million years ago, which passes, as I said, right through New Albany. And we've examined several digs around New Albany that expose the boundaries over these. I'm going to show you some of those slides. I can't show you all of them because the slideshow will go on forever. But the Paleogene period is the younger period, and of course the Cretaceous is older. It's standard to have your oldest beds or oldest layers and time intervals on the bottom, and then the younging direction is upwards as you move towards the top. And notice what's going on globally at this time with respect to life on Earth. The 66 million year time interval documents the point at which non-avian dinosaurs became extinct. So we know dinosaurs are still existing as the birds. So theropod dinosaurs gave rise to the birds. In fact, it's hard in the fossil record sometimes to distinguish between birds and dinosaurs. But nevertheless, birds are still around, so technically theropod dinosaurs are, but all the non-avian dinosaurs were extinct, all the familiar dinosaurs that you read about as a kid, the big ones, are all extinct by 66 million years ago. Looking at specifically a geologic column for this part of Mississippi and, of course, west central Alabama, focus on the 66 million year time interval and trace it all the way over here. I guess my arrow shows up there, doesn't it? Does my arrow show up on the slideshow? Okay, cool. I can't see it from here. So we're looking at the Paleogene time period. You'll also hear me use one of its subdivisions, the Paleocene. I'll use the term Danian and Clayton. And those are the terms you're going to hear refer to the top side or the younger side of the KPG boundary. And then, of course, the Cretaceous period and Prairie Bluff Formation around Houston. But by the time you get north of Pontotoc, the Prairie Bluff Formation is replaced by the Owl Creek Formation, just to put those in context. But they all straddle the KPG boundary. We're going to look at that particular interval where the Cretaceous ends and the very beginning of the Paleocene or the Paleogene, where a major disturbance in the sedimentary record and in the fossil record occurred. And this is what it looks like more locally. So we're zooming into a more refined look at the layers in this area. So again, mostly south of Pontotoc, the Prairie Bluff Formation in the Cretaceous. North of Pontotoc, mostly the Owl Creek Formation. And in the bottom of the Clayton, there are a series of beds. Now, I've divided them up into 3 different beds, but they're actually more complicated than that, but I had to simplify it for illustration purposes. So you're familiar with the little community called Cliviot, Mississippi? Am I saying it right? I was corrected by someone from that area who said you need to shorten that first syllable even more.
Cliviot.
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 Cliviot?
Cliviot.
Calibit. Oh, Calibit. Oh, Calibit. So I was saying it wrong all this time. I must sound real ignorant when I'm in Calibit. Okay. Calibit. I'll keep checking in with you, Jill. So, because I'm still probably going to say Calibia. But forgive me if I do. No offense to people in that part of Tippah County. But nevertheless, there used to be a park in Calibia. Okay, does anybody know this park? It was not well advertised, and it's sort of a de facto park. I think the town of Calibia may have maintained it at one time, but there's a spring right in that little park. When I say park, I don't mean something with a playground or anything, but it was just a nice little stroll, a little boardwalk, a modest boardwalk with stairs, and you still see remnants of it, but it's been consumed by the woods, and nobody maintains it anymore. So there's vines all over it, and you've got to sneak into somebody's backyard to get to the old spring. But at that old spring, there is what's called the type section, where these beds were defined by a USGS geologist working in Alabama. And his name was McNeil. And he named these interesting beds at the base of the Paleogene in Mississippi and Alabama. A lot of people don't use the term Calibiot anymore. I do because I love it. I can't pronounce it, so it's a challenge just to learn it, how to pronounce it correctly. But no, I think they're very useful terms. So you have 2 limestones in that bed. So I'm defining it further from just narrowing the definition of McNeil's original term, Calibiot. There's actually 2 discrete limestone beds. The lower Calibiot limestone bed, most of the shells in that, in fact, all the shells in it, are shells reworked from the underlying Cretaceous, okay? So our contact between the Paleogene is right here at the 66 million year interval, or horizon. But above that are these shells reworked from the Prairie Bluff and the Owl Creek formations. I've lost my arrow, there we go. And then above that bed, and so this lower bed has these, we're going to talk about these in just a few minutes, these tiny glass beads that are about 1.5 to 2.5 millimeters in diameter. And we're going to talk about this in just a second. But one major feature of this bed is it contains a lot of broken shells, sometimes whole shells, from the subjacent or the Cretaceous just below it. And then we get into a burrowed interval, which contains a lot of plant debris, but also contains shells. Sometimes it has a lot of shells. Sometimes the shells are very crushed, very fine grained. And it contains some of the first animals that appeared in the fossil record in the Paleocene or Paleogene. Then by the time you get into the Upper Columbian limestone, you get a purely Paleocene assemblage that's nothing like that in the Cretaceous. You first start seeing the Paleocene animals in this bed. You see some of them. But by this time, you get a full-blown Paleocene suite, and you see no more Cretaceous animals except for the survivors. And there were very few survivors. A major extinction event occurred at this point in time, 66 million years ago. For the past several decades, this extinction event is attributed to an asteroid hitting the Yucatan Peninsula. I know a lot of you probably heard about it. You've probably seen a show about it or read about it in a magazine or in books. There's been numerous books published on, or at least numerous articles published on the topic, and a few books. But this crater is called the Chicxulub crater that was created by this asteroid, which is estimated between 6 and 9 miles in diameter. There is also possibly a piece of that asteroid hit just off the coast of Guinea in Western Africa. It's still debated about if this was a piece of the Chicxulub asteroid, but it seems to date to about the same time period. But it was only about 400 meters in diameter. So what, that's a golf ball compared to the moon? No, but yeah, so 6 to 9 miles in diameter for the Chicxulub asteroid, but only about 400 meters in diameter for the Nadir crater asteroid. And this was an enormous jolt to the Earth. And it created a lot of chaos on the surface of the Earth. We don't have time to get into all that chaos, because I want to show you the Highway 15 construction and a lot of the fossils that we're finding. But it created a crater about 110 miles in diameter and 12 miles deep. An incredible hole in the Earth. But you don't really see a hole today because most of it backfilled. But it is the second largest impact structure on Earth. And numerous other structures have been found that date to different time periods since this one was first identified. The hypothesis actually started around 1980 that an asteroid must have hit the Earth and caused this extinction 66 million years ago. Extinction had been known about for many decades, but the cause of the extinction was unknown until about 1990. It first became known to scientists working for professional geologists working for a petroleum company. And they were able to find a feature in the southern Gulf of Mexico that turned out to be this crater once they mapped it. One of the things that I'm going to talk to you about that we see that is a good indicator of the cataclysm that happened 66 million years ago are these little tektites, these little tiny beads that you can just see with the naked eye. We'll see some slides of them, and I'll try to show them to you in our samples that we brought with us today. But these little beads, consider them drops of rain that froze. Okay, consider a frozen raindrop, if you will. And that's what these are. But they're not frozen water. They are congealed silica, the same stuff that's in sand. These things result from the heat from the impact blasting and heating anything that was made of sand or sandy rock, superheating it, vaporizing it, first liquefying it and then vaporizing it so that it creates these silica vapor clouds that drifted in the atmosphere and at tremendous speeds, and so a lot faster than a regular rainstorm, okay? Then once that silica started cooling in these clouds, okay, consider it molten glass, I didn't mention that. Consider it clouds of molten glass. And that's what these beads are. And an example of them is there in the right from Colombia. all of our little beads, our microtectites, are sadly degraded. They're so small and delicate that ours have degraded to a type of clay. Sometimes the clay has been replaced by calcite, but you can still see the morphology, the structure of them under a microscope. Oftentimes we have to get them back to the lab before they decompose, but it's the moisture in the ground that's kept them from decomposing. And often we don't see them when we first come to a site that we suspect to be a KBG site. We have to dig for them. We have to dig fresh rock out to see it, and you can see them. But nevertheless, these superheated silica plumes are raining glass, not shards of glass, but little bitty congealed droplets of glass falling out into the atmosphere. And these little glass beads have little bubbles inside of them, so that when they hit the ocean, they have some buoyancy. They can float in the ocean. Some may float on top. Some may have small bubbles in them, and they don't float very high in the water column. They sink a little bit, but they're buoyant for a long time. Some people have speculated that some of these glass beads were drifting in the ocean for hundreds of years before they were completely buried. This is an example of another cataclysm which was going on at the same time. This is actually the second major cataclysm that's been well documented that was going on 66 million years ago. It actually precedes 66 million years ago. It actually started around 85 or 80 million years ago, but it culminated in tremendous eruptions in west central India that created these huge deposits of flood basalts. So we think there was a lot of contamination of the atmosphere from ash and other chemicals, sulfurous chemicals in particular, being distributed broadly, perhaps globally, due to these violent but slow eruptions in west central India at the same time. Back to our northeast Mississippi locality. We're going to go on a road trip and document what we've been seeing starting in the Houston area and going north. Most of these sites are, half of the sites are lie directly on Highway 15 or immediately adjacent to it. Some of these sites are a little bit further afield, but less than about a half a mile, right, Kendall, for some of these sites? Where did Kendall go? We visited one of them yesterday. Within a mile, but it's still Pontotoc Ridge, and it's still telling the story, part of the story, about the KBG boundary. So let's begin in Houston at that same landfill where we saw a very well-marked, at least with respect to color, boundary. Now, the scientists, myself and the others, we're looking for other things, not always the color. We're looking for a lot of other things. We're looking at other changes, which we're going to talk to you about today. But at the landfill, it's very impressive because you see a marked color change between the Cretaceous and the Paleocene. Now, keep this in mind. Not all red sediments lying on top of chalk. In fact, most of the red soils and sediments lying on top of chalk in Chickasaw County, where Houston is. In fact, even in that landfill, most of it is not KBG boundary. It's much younger stuff lying on top. It all tends to oxidize and turn the same color. So what we're looking for is a lot subtler. We're looking for fossil changes, we're looking for certain mineral preservations, and we're looking for those microtectites. Here's a close-up of the view in the right-hand side of the frame. In some places, there is a thin clay bed, like at Houston, where you have this thin layer of clay sitting right on top of the chalk. But it's not everywhere. Usually there's a body of sand, we call them the channel sands, or the event sands, or the microtectite bed, or the microspheral bed. So we've got several names for this stuff. But it's generally sandy. And sometimes the sandiness is imparted by the presence of the microtectites and certain other minerals in the channel sands. But in this case, we've got this clay, this boundary clay at this locality. This is a later shot of the same Prairie Bluff landfill, and we couldn't get all the way to the top because I didn't bring my telescoping ladder on this trip. But we were lucky because at the toe of the slope, we found a big block that had drifted from the top, and that's what my arrows are pointing to in the top of the left-hand picture. where this big block that we found at the foot, showing the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary. In the Houston area, we see both of these oysters. These little oysters are of Paleocene age. The one on the right is considered a survivor because we see it in the Cretaceous, but it's particularly abundant in the Paleogene, the subsequent Paleogene or the subsequent Paleocene, because all of a sudden it doesn't have as much competition as it did in the Cretaceous, because there's quite a few different types of oysters in the preceding Cretaceous. But it's actually one of our few survivors that we have documented. So the guy on the right, Gryphaeostria vomer, lived in the Cretaceous, and then all of a sudden we see him in, sometimes in beds, layers that are full of the Gryphaeostria shells. But we also see, mostly south of Algoma, we see this guy on the left, Pycnodon pulascensis. It is not a survivor. It appears suddenly. We see oysters like it in the Cretaceous, but they're much larger. In fact, well, I'll get to that slide in just a second. But I'll show you a size comparison between the Cretaceous Pycnodon and the Paleocene Pycnodon. But all we see of the oysters are the small oysters. So that in and of itself, when we see large oysters in the Cretaceous and the small oysters in the Paleocene, we know there's been, just with that evidence alone, there's been some major transition in time. Some kind of event. But we have lots of these. I'm just showing you a few easy examples of the evidence of this extinction and the sudden appearance of new species. Here's what the Cretaceous oysters look like. This is a different species of Pycnodon on the left, and it's rather large, as you can see, several inches in diameter. Some of you, or one of you, brought some specimens earlier that we were looking at, and they can actually get quite large and thick. And the guy on the right, a lot of you probably seen this oyster if you've collected fossils in the chalks or in the Owl Creek Formation in this area, from here to all the way to Starkville and even further south in Alabama. It's a very conspicuous, very easy to identify oyster. But those are your two big oysters of the Cretaceous. And this is the Paleocene Pycnodon pulascensis inside the Cretaceous Mutabilis 4 scale. So big difference. Now, Pycnodon mutabilis, the Cretaceous oyster, it starts out small. Everybody starts out small, right? You got to grow to be a big size. And sometimes the adults of Pycnodon mutabilis do not get that big, but they're shaped differently. They always have a distinctive shape. Well, that can actually vary in environment, but they have other characteristics that help us identify mutabilis. But the little pulascensis, they never got that big. They never got bigger than about the size of a quarter or a $half. Was about maximum size. When we get to Pontotoc, we had access to a borrow pit in South Pontotoc for a number of years, where the landowner was selling the fill for construction. And this is just, what, a 1/10 or 2/10 of a mile from Highway 15 in South Pontotoc. This has also attracted our KPG working group, interested in looking at a couple of million years prior to the extinction event. And here we have some students from the University of South Florida and Brooklyn College in the slide on the right. And we even get the neighborhood kids in touch. A lot of these outcrops are in neighborhoods, and this particular site in South Pontotoc in 2016, there were a lot of kids that year living in this, but subsequent trips after 2018, I never ran into many kids. But you get them roped into it, and all of a sudden you're finding 10 times what you were when you first got there. But also distributing a lot of it, because a lot of the kids like shark teeth, so I have to share some of the shark and show them how. And these two in particular, I forget their names, but they wanted to know how to find shark teeth. And that may explain why subsequent trips we did not find many shark teeth. Roger, I'm just now seeing you, man. It's good to see you. I haven't seen you in a while. At this site was a particular abundance of echinoids, or urchins. And we've documented over 8 different species of these little urchins in the Cretaceous prairie bluff chalk in the Pontotoc area. And these guys next to the quarter are a type of urchin called a lamp urchin. one of the types of urchins that I work on in particular. Most of the shells outside of the oyster shells are molds. They're molds or casts of the inside or outsides of the shells, like these two bivalves, or all three bivalves in the upper part. But you see many different species, and some people are hesitant to distinguish or differentiate between the different species, but just upon shape alone, you can see that there's quite a few species of different molds in the Prairie Bluff Formation. But after having looked at them such a long time, I'm able to distinguish at least a genus and sometimes species in these, as I have on the right with Anatomia antiradiata is that species name on that one. And yet another one of the little urchins. It's this little heart urchin in the bottom center slide, also from the same Barrow pit. I invite a lot of clubs on outings. I work with probably 10 different clubs in the Southeast, including one club from Missouri. They came down one year. They often come twice a year. And a father and son found these pen shells, this type of bivalve that seats itself or buries itself up to the top edge into the seafloor. I'll show you a picture of one of those in just a second. But Paul and Casey Thayer were so careful in excavating. These things are hard to excavate to come out whole. As you can see, these pieces broke and they had to puzzle them back together. They spent 90% of their time, while everybody else was picking up shark teeth and sea urchins, Paul and Casey spent their time devoted to uncovering these pen shells, these very fragile pen shells. Casey was, Casey was only 12 years old at that time. Now I'm happy to say, after having worked with him on several trips, including the influence from his parents, Casey is getting his master's degree in paleontology somewhere out west. So these kids that are involved in these clubs get a lot of exposure. And every now and then, some of them, like with the North Mississippi Gem and Mineral Society, they're in the back there, they've had a few of their members go on to careers in geology. Here's a buried pen shell. They keep the upper part that they open up free of sediment so that they can filter feed. We also, at this same locality in Pontotoc, we found some of these nautilus-like creatures, a type of nautiloid called Eutrophosphorus. And here is a cross-section. Looks like I didn't finish with this slide, but here is a cross-section of what these shells look like, and with part of a modern nautiloid on the side. Yeah, I didn't finish these slides here. Okay. Moving further north along Highway 15, we get to a site that was only open for a few days before it was covered back up. In fact, it was only open because there was a lot of rain, and that explains how wet the ground is here. But a former colleague of mine, Charles Swan, with the Mississippi Mineral Resources Institute, we were looking at the Highway 15 four-laning in 2016 and found two of these sites. And this particular one in Friendship, we were able to get to see the KPG boundary. So the boundary is below this mud right here, somewhere down here. And these beds are basically the beds I illustrated in one of those earlier slides. And this would be the upper Chalybeate limestone right here. And this down here would be the lower Chalybeate limestone. Chalybeate. Here is the name, or here's the oyster, one of the oysters that we saw in the earlier slide. Does anybody remember the name? Including my colleagues over here. Do you remember the name of this guy?
I can't see it really.
Oh, okay, that's right. You have an excuse because you're off there to the side. So can you pull around and can you recognize it? I'm going to see how good the quality of my slides are. Which one is this? Right. So these are very different shells, even though you having seen them for the first time, they look very similar. But once you've seen a lot of them, you see that they are quite distinct from one another. And Gryphaeostrea vomer is more elegant looking than Puliscensis. But this one is the survivor. This is one that survived the extinction event and it's found in the Chalybeate limestone at top, but it's also found in the underlying Cretaceous. Here are some of those same beds at the Friendship excavation. Notice the bedding there. Their thin layers can be seen there. We're not always able to visualize the very thin layers. This is in the Owl Creek Formation, below all that mud you saw in the earlier slide. And these layers represent, each individual layer represents some type of interval. They could be tidal layers, so they could represent portion of a day or a day and a half if they're tidal. Here is a big fragment of lignite, which is a piece of fossil wood found in the Owl Creek beds, the Cretaceous. And at Friendship, we found blocks of rock that you can really visualize. This is above the Owl Creek. This is in the boundary beds, where you can actually see these little microtectites. And I'm pointing out, you're looking for little spheres. And can everybody kind of make those out where I have a black arrow? Sometimes the tektite is in place, and sometimes it's exploded from drying out, and it's left a void. There's very few samples that we've taken back to the lab where after months or years where you can see them, because they dry out. And all the preservation techniques that I've tried, I've got one more that I'm going to try and preserve them so that they don't dry out and disintegrate. But this is the lower Chalybeate limestone, is where we see the microtectites. And here we are again. So we saw some upper Chalybeate limestone that was high in the section at the Friendship site, and then that fragment of lower Chalybeate that you saw in the slide previous to this. Now, the Clayton Formation, upper Chalybeate limestone, I don't have any good pictures of the limestone from the Friendship site. It was kind of a mess, and we didn't really get any good photographs from there because there was a lot of fill. When you go to these sites, they're moving the dirt around, and it's not always a pretty site, and you kind of have to reconstruct it in your head, visualize what's going on. But here is a coquina limestone. Coquina means it's just a shell-rich limestone from the upper Chalybeate. So this contains only Paleocene animals, none reworked from the Cretaceous, and that's an important point. And so I'll ask if any one of you have seen this type of rock from Pontotoc to New Albany. If you've seen any of that type of rock, I'd like to hear about it. So again, that's the upper Chalybeate limestone from Ecru. We're going to move on. This is a site that was brought to our attention in the fall of last year by one of our field colleagues, Kendall Bullock. He knew to monitor Highway 15 in that area, and he really produced with this one. Here we have a light-colored Owl Creek formation with the boundary bed sitting on top of it. So this is a pretty straightforward site. Initially, I was confused because it was upon close inspection. It's a little bit different from the Prairie Bluff landfill. And all along the outcrop belt from Houston to Walnut to Highway 72, it changes. And we might talk about why it changed a little bit, but there are these little nuances that occur as you go further north or further south. This is a site right here in New Albany that we investigated in 2011, early on in our collaborative research. That's Dr. Neil Landon up front, who is the original leader of the KPG working group. Now we've got a couple of different leaders. Part of the group, a great deal of the group is at the University of New Mexico. But we have collaborators, about a total of 30 people, including universities all over North America, and a couple of, some of the research is being done overseas in the Western Atlantic. And one at the University of Mexico, University System of Mexico in Mexico City. We've got a colleague down there too that's helping out. An aerial view of this site is on the right, and it's just at the end of Shannon Cove Road. if you're familiar with that road. And here is the break between the Paleocene, or Paleogene, and the underlying Cretaceous. With, that's Jill wearing the same shirt that she's wearing today. And that's Charles Swan off to the left. We used to collaborate a lot with the MMRI, who he represented. But now they don't have that program anymore, sadly. So Charles retired in southern Georgia. There's Charles standing right in front of the KPG boundary. So here, the boundary is not at the color change. It's actually just above the color change in a layer where the texture changes. So it's not always a color difference. And here's what the microtectites from this site look like under an electron microscope. So here is one of the round, most of the microtectites are round, but they actually occur in quite a variety of shapes. The shapes are usually rounded, but the most common one is round. And it has a bunch of these objects on the surface, which indicate something. I won't go into what those indicate, those little blisters at the top, but I would like to draw your attention to these smaller spheres inside a larger microtectite. Those are the bubbles, and the bubbles fill with a mineral, but they were originally bubbles. Well, how do we know they were originally just space? We know that from better preserved microtectites. We know that these were hollow spaces, gas-filled spaces, and those gases produced the minerals that made little solid spheres inside a larger sphere. But otherwise, they were buoyant in water and probably traveled long distances. Here's an example of an ammonite, one of the nautiloid-type creatures found at a site in New Albany by Matthew and Roger Lambert, formerly of the North Mississippi Gem and Mineral Society. So this came out of the 4th Street basin. So this came out of the Cretaceous. But we do find these ammonites reworked into the boundary beds. And right down here are fragments of these really large ammonites reworked into the boundary beds. And by reworked, I mean these were animals either living on the seafloor when the impact happened, or or dead examples. They were, dead shells, just shells, vacant shells. And the idea is that they were carried some distance via a tsunami and redeposited. At least in some cases. In some cases, they're just simply reworked by other means. Here's another cross-section of what these guys look like. So they had these fluid and gas-filled chambers. And what we're seeing in the example that the Lamberts found is an internal mold, where sediment from the seafloor filled in these chambers because the shell was fragmented some. Holes just big enough to allow sediment to come in there to fill and produce this very complexly chambered mold. And these animals are related to the modern squid. They're in the same group of organisms called the cephalopods. This is another type of critter found in the Cretaceous in the New Albany area. This is a type of Gorgonian. I'll show you a picture of one of these guys here. The Gorgonian is an octocoral, so it's a type of coral, but it doesn't produce polyps in the skeleton. The polyps are actually not preserved. They're in the fleshy part on the surface of the skeleton instead of actually in the skeleton themselves. These things stuck to the stalk on the right are little tiny oysters that have attached themselves to a dead Gorgonian stalk. And here we are with San Jose State and PRI in Ithaca, New York, another collaborator, yet another collaborating institution, exposing the KPG boundary just right at the Concord intersection, in fact, in 2021. And here we got reasonably well-preserved microtectites. You'll see the little round calcite replaced spherules, but just below it is a void. You're still seeing my arrow, right? I can't see the screen, so I don't trust it. And there's numerous voids here. And I say they're voids, they're actually the sphere that is cracked open. The sphere, parts of the sphere are still in there. Here's the same site several years earlier, some 13, 14 years earlier. We're studying the Cretaceous beds right below the boundary beds. And in one particular part of the Cretaceous beds was rich with what seemed to be a decomposed reef of bryozoans. And there was these little stalk things, little twiggy shaped things. And my collaborators this time, back then, included the Natural History Museum in London and the College of Worcester. And we had all these papers planned together. We produced one paper out of the 5 we discussed. And then Dr. Taylor, sitting right, he retired and decided that he had other fish to fry before he retired. So that work still remains unpublished. But if you're not familiar with what a bryozoan looks like, these are modern examples of bryozoans. They are colonial animals like corals, but like corals and other colonial animals like bees, ants, there was a distribution of labor in the colony. So that this distribution of labor in these colonial animals causes a variable appearance on the surface of the skeleton. I don't have any examples to show you, but sometimes this creates an interesting pattern on the surface of the skeleton, because some places are where the workers were housed or lived, and some places on the skeleton were where the defenders lived, and the cleaners lived in other places, and they had different crypts that they secreted to produce the colony. And it creates a very interesting appearance in some of these encrusting organisms. But they were filter feeders, like most of these animals on the seafloor. This is a bunch of them where they extended their lophophores, their feeding organs, to filter feed in the water column, get little particulate matter. Here's yet another type of Gorgonian, this one from the Concord site as we move further north. These are fragments from the underlying Cretaceous. And this is an approximation of what these fossil ones look like, a modern Paragorgonia for comparison. And at one site, the Lamberts again were able to examine the site that I was only able to get up for one day, and I couldn't get up there anymore that season. By that time at Concord, actually closer to Gale, if you know where I'm talking about, they were just moving so quickly, and I couldn't get away. But the Lamberts visited the site twice, and this is the son, Matthew Lambert, and they were able to produce a lot of notes and send me a lot of pictures and to document as amateurs what was going on at that site. They produced, the father, Roger, produced 1.5 pages of notes, which are quite valuable to me, just as my own notes would be. Also at Concord, west of Concord, in a creek bed in 2016, we made, myself and Michael Estes of Pontotoc, another person that helps me or has helped me in the field in the past, made an amazing discovery of a horned dinosaur fossil. The first ever found, and the first only found to this day, east of the Western Interior Seaway. The horned dinosaurs are known from the western margin of the old seaway. They connected the Arctic Ocean with the Gulf of Mexico. None are known from the eastern half of the continent until we found this one. And one of the major findings, in addition to it being the only horned dinosaur fossil ever reported from North America, their ancestors had been found in eastern North America, but not the horned dinosaurs themselves, but before they became horny. Before they possessed horns, they had these precursors called the frilled dinosaurs. They maintained their frills, but these ancestral smaller frilled dinosaurs were present in Maryland. We know they were present in Maryland. But scientists have always assumed that they became extinct, that the horned dinosaurs in eastern North America, the frilled dinosaurs of eastern North America never gave rise to horned dinosaurs. We think that they did actually become extinct in eastern North America, and it was when that first land bridge, multiple land bridges formed about 66 million years ago. having really nothing to do with the asteroid impact itself, but they were forming anyway. And two land bridges formed, one here in the northern part of the hemisphere and one in the southern part of the seaway. So one in the northern part and one in the southern part. It's been the subject of debate for many years whether or not the northern land bridge formed for the southern land bridge. But the Owl Creek, it was found in the Owl Creek Formation. The Owl Creek, the Mississippi ceratopsian dinosaur, horned dinosaur, was of the type, just from the tooth, we could tell it was from the type of horned dinosaur from around Texas and New Mexico. So we concluded that southern land bridge formed before the northern land bridge. This is just one piece of evidence. But, a recent discovery of a KPG boundary site was also in that same area, north of Concord, in a place called Cotton Plant, if you're familiar with it. We found this beautiful exposure of the KPG boundary beds, showing a very discrete color change there and a textural change across the boundary. Our boundary is right here. It does not include that yellow zone. That yellow zone is actually just a weathered portion of the Cretaceous. But above that is a sand that's often burrowed towards the top. And we do have microtektites from that sand. They didn't preserve very well, but we do have some specimens. And this is a blow-up of what the burrows look like in cross-section. And these burrows, this size, are generally thought to be produced, size and shape indicates ghost shrimp, or something on the order of a burrowing shrimp-like organism. And at Ripley, we've been studying a locality called Owl Creek since about 2010. Myself, the American Museum of Natural History, and some of the other institutions. The various institutions and parties involved in this working group have different contributions and are not studying all sites. We divided the labor up. I cover all the sites, but a lot of them work on specific sites, have their own projects. But this was early on, and when this picture was taken, we thought, well, we'll wrap this up in a couple of years. Well, it's been 15 years later or so, or it will be 15 years later soon. We're still finding just a wealth of information. And Highway 15 is largely responsible for that. Here's some examples of some of the other types of Cretaceous creatures you can find. The fossils are not preserved with the same fidelity everywhere. We do find these ammonites, these coiled ammonites like this. We have some examples on the table. These examples from Ingomar do not preserve the original shell, but they preserve an internal mold. And we have some of the straight ammonites, as you see here, the baculites. We didn't have any good KPG boundary beds here. They're very weathered here. They've oxidized and a lot of structure. The fossils are dissolved, and it's just terrible to study the KPG boundary beds. But the landowner was cleaning up a service road and took his equipment and scraped the side of the hillside and exposed a nice boundary section there where we sampled the limestone to study it further in a lab situation. And the very top layer of this limestone is rich, again, with these fragments of bryozoans, these filter-feeding colonial animals. And the individual animals of these guys are quite microscopic. But when you have a colony of them, they're quite visible to the naked eye, as you can see here. So that's our tour of the KPG Highway from Houston to Ripley. Actually, the boundary beds extend from Starkville, and even south of Starkville, as you can see here. The southernmost major town is Starkville, and all the way up to Walnut. This is some of our KPG crew working one of the most important sites this summer. We had 2 teams this summer, and this is the site in Starkville that has attracted a lot of our attention from our team. It is the second largest exposure, at least it was until the Cotton Plant site showed up. It was the second largest exposure of the KPG boundary beds in the southeast. The largest exposure of these beds is still along the Tombigbee River. But the landowners have refused us access to it the last several years. So we're over here in Mississippi enjoying the Mississippi climate. Now, before I close the talk and invite any questions to the floor, as of yesterday, we finished installing exhibit. I say we, I didn't have anything to do with it, other than the educational programming that will revolve around interpretation of our dinosaur exhibit. But my colleagues at the museum finished installing a dinosaur exhibit yesterday. And the grand opening is today, and it will be here till January 5th, so 6 months of dinosaurs in front of the museum. This is an outdoor installation primarily. There's some indoor components to it, but it's mostly an outdoor installation in front of the Museum of Natural Science. How many of you have been to the Museum of Natural Science in Jackson? Okay. Did you see the dinosaur trail in back of the museum that we installed about 2.5 years ago? So the museum is now surrounded by dinosaurs, at least for the the next 6 months. So we've got the permanent dinosaur trail out back, and we've got the temporary dinosaur installation out front. So you got to come and see the dinosaurs over the next 6 months, preferably this summer. The dinosaur trail will always be there, but the dinosaurs out front, which I must say are a little bit more impressive than our ones in back, but still really, the stuff in back is really cool. But because ours in back are not animatronic, they don't move around and make noises. The ones in front do. Well, that is all I've got for you today. Do you guys have any questions for me about the discoveries along Highway 15 before I answer Kendall's question?
Most of the stuff on the table up there was found up down 15th Ward.
Right. Except for this jawbone right here of a Triceratops. So some of you may not know much about the horned dinosaurs and what their jaws look like. So this is an example of what the jaw looked like in a horned dinosaur. The front part is missing where the beak was. They had a beak out. They had a toothless beak in the front. So this is not the horned dinosaur fossil from around Concord. It was actually just a single tooth was found at Concord, but it was diagnostic enough to identify it as a horned dinosaur. And I did not bring it today because it is quite precious.
We have a cast on exhibit.
Pardon? Oh yes, that's right. They have a cast on exhibit right here. And in fact, the cast itself is quite valuable because the mold broke. And I sent it to a colleague in Columbus College, Georgia. He was going to repair it and make casts for himself in their little museum. But anyway, I don't know what became of that. We have to mold it again and make new casts, and I have not done that yet.
Do you do that yourself, make molds?
I do some of it, not as well as my former volunteer preparator and molder and caster, Peter. I had him from 2005 to 2017. We did a lot of molding and casting, which we shared with the Union County, a few pieces with the Union County Heritage Museum. We did a lot of sharing of molds and casts with other museums, University of Alabama, McLean Science Center in Birmingham, and some of the larger institutions, Boy Scouts. But I don't really have time to do that, nor did I have Peter's expertise. But you know, when you have something precious like that, the first thing to do is to get it stable and to make reproductions of it, because you may not have the original fossil. There actually have been fossils in the state fossil collection. Who manages the state fossil collection?
You do.
Yeah, okay, good, yeah. Just to make sure you guys are paying attention.
What?
Yeah, so I'm the caretaker, the curator. Not now, because I'm here now talking to you guys, but you know, when I get back.
We thought that was a trick question. We all went, we answered?
No. Sometimes my questions are very, very easy. We've had fossils that we've had to discard because they just did not survive. They are contaminated with unstable minerals and they fall apart. We have ways of working with that. We have preservatives, pickling agents, as it were, for fossils that will help solidify them and keep bad minerals from growing. There are bad minerals. We've got a lot of them in our Mississippi sediments. Pyrite is a bad mineral, at least sedimentary pyrite. Metamorphic pyrite is stable, but sedimentary pyrite is a very bad mineral because it damages fossils. Any other questions? All right, Chase, if you will pass out the pop quiz. We're going to see if your knowledge reflects. Okay, no, I'm just kidding.
I'm like, "Ugh."
Yeah. Yeah, but we've had a lot of fun along Highway 15. It's been an interesting journey. We have heard that in August, word is on the street, we heard it straight from DOT yesterday, when Kendall and I were south of New Albany. We heard that they were going to start on the Cotton Plant Walnut leg of the Highway 15 4-laning. I guess we all knew that was coming, right, sooner or later. But yeah, the idea is, I thought it might stop at Ripley, but it's going to go all the way to Walnut. So, can't wait.
We're all like,
Can't wait. All right, if you brought anything here today that you'd like to have identified, we can do fossils at this table, and they can do Native American artifacts at that table over there. You guys outnumber us, don't you? You just grew by 2 people.
Thank you, George.
Thank you.